Attention, no, that's great. It's such a lively space. This microphone will help for some of our soft-spoken people, but we'll have at it. First off, welcome. Welcome to one and all. All of you who have traveled far and near, you will hear this repeated throughout this whole presentation and event. We thank you for coming. We thank you for making this effort and being present for this acknowledgement of the life and times of Patrick Francis Brennan. As my friend from childhood, Derek Stahl, would say, plethora. It means a lot. But it does mean a lot to us, his immediate family. What can we say about this father, uncle, cousin, companion, and friend? Well, we're going to give it a go. Dad didn't stand on ceremony, but he's getting it now, whether he wanted it or not. And with the participation and good graces of everyone here, he's not going to get a dozen fair-haired damsels playing harps, or a bugler playing taps, or even a hairy-legged bagpiper. But we do have a piano and a couple of 12-string guitars. It amounts to 230 strings. Also, a host of speakers with stories and anecdotes. I'm looking forward to hearing them and adding to and even correcting my own recollections. We are celebrating him through music, stories, and poetry, because that's the way we roll. And this also marks the first time my family and many of my relatives hear Yelling play. And the first time they hear us play together at the finale. So it's an auspicious occasion, Dad would appreciate. You see, that was a fortuitous thing about Dad. He had a long, happy life. And he was a lucky man to have been surrounded by such amazing and wonderful people, all of you. I want to celebrate those connections today while we give him recognition. It's quite remarkable that Dad was the last of a generation of a Calgary family that was never a dynasty, but a dynamic part, nonetheless, of the fabric of Albertan and Canadian society at that point in history. And he was born in a family, being the second youngest in a family of 5 siblings, meant that he had all those big brothers and a big sister to look up to. But he could still lord it over a youngest sister. By the time I came along, my earliest memories were that I lived in a land of giants. Not just from me being a child, of course, but from the size of the personalities of just even the relatives. They were big, colorful people with booming voices and boisterous laughs. From the near mythical, tragic figure of Uncle Don, outdoorsman par excellence, whom I never met but only knew about in family legend, and the tall, handsome presence of my judicious Uncle Bill, with a booming baritone voice and with such a hearty laugh you had to laugh. Not to mention the Tallulah Bankhead-like husky-tinged voice of dear, fun-loving Aunt Mary Jane, to the kindly and enveloping demeanor of Nana and Aunt Peggy, 2 such refined ladies of lace and cream. The soft-spoken James Stewart-like manner of Uncle Bill Fowler, the bubbly grace and delicacy of Aunt Rita, who I was convinced secretly moonlighted as a model for English clothing companies because she was so stunningly beautiful. And the old Gaelic resolve and quiet dignity of Bampi, so named because young cousin Laurie heard them talking about the then blockbuster Disney movie, Bambi, and promptly found that easier to say than Grandpa. I should add that I'm wearing Bampi's green silk tie, and his enamel tie clip, and a Scottish half-moon pin with an amber thistle from Nana. Into this nest of robes and regal ladies, characters all, was my father. Seemingly innocuous as the littlest boy of the family, the subject of much good-natured teasing, often along the lines of Bill and Dawn shaking him awake to get him dressed for school and him groggily doing it at 2 a.m. He was not above wreaking vengeance on his brothers by shooting them in the butt with a BB rifle when they ducked through the backyard hedge to go to school. what did Dad become? And who was he in addition to a small businessman, a hobby carpenter, sports car and motorcycle buff, not to mention with duties as a father and husband? Dad was a sailor, a recreational sailor, but still a sailor with a love of the sea. "I will go down to the sea in ships again," was the poet John Masefield's line. And Dad sought a star to steer his enthusiasm by. At the age of 11, he set out by exploring the water by getting himself launched on a log from a log jam on the Bow River, prompting a passerby to notify the fire department to rescue him. You might be interested to know that he excelled in this Power and Sailor Squadron course he took before he bought the C&C 30 on the coast. When he sold that sailboat in 1985 or so to concentrate on farming and motorcycles, I remember it was odd to think of him without a boat, landlocked, without a paddle. There was a classic Navy cadet trainer I had around the shop to work on, but that's another story. Luckily, Cousin Grady had a boat building project for him to latch onto later, and there's a story in that. Let me take you back to the beginning. After he had built from plans a somewhat dangerous ice boat loosely christened the Streak, that he sailed with like-minded chums on frozen Chestermere and Exshaw lakes. This missile on skates had 3-foot-long blades on it that could cut a moose in half. It went like stink. Our story really starts with starting to sail with Mum when they got involved with the Calgary Yacht Club. They started on club boats, the Little Flying Juniors, that in my experience from sailing a borrowed one on Windermere proved to be tippy as hell. You just had to change your mind and the boat would lean to that side. Anyway, that was their entry-level boat, and Mum and Dad rapidly graduated to the larger one-design racer called the Flying Dutchman. Now stay with me here, because I'm leading up to our nautical theme slideshow and the accompanying music. The Flying Dutchman was christened Tango, and my mother painted the name on the stern. That's tango as in the dance, not tangle as in the rope. Okay? At one time, while it was in vogue, I believe Mum and Dad danced a little bit of it. It was a particularly apt boat name, given that Pat and Patty's teamwork won them a few trophies in the time they were with the Calgary Yacht Club. Thereafter, Dad bought a kit from Small Craft Canada in Calgary and assembled a 21-foot one-design Olympic racer, the International Tempest, and it was christened after my mother, Patricia. I remember being tucked into various places on the boats when I was little, wearing those red canvas kapok life jackets that took the skin off your chin if you turned your head too quick. And by the time all 4 of us were born, we had all spent time in the spinnaker buckets on the foredecks while Mum was out on the trapeze, controlling the head sails and countering the heeling of the boat and the spilling of wind. Dad instilled a love and respect for being out on the water. If there was a storm and there wasn't lightning, he'd gear up and say to me, "We're going up." While it was always a wet thrill, I did especially look forward to the shot of brandy on shore afterwards. Now, my wife Yelene listened to our stories and hearing those names, Flying Dutchman, Tango, Tempest, and my dad's sailing career, it all captured her imagination, suggesting romantic adventure on the high seas. So different from her own unique childhood in Taiwan. Our stories inspired her in honor of Dad and in reflection of his life. The bucolic pastoral moments mixed in with the stormy passages, to want to play excerpts from Beethoven's Tempest, Astor Piazzolla's Tango Rhapsody, that is also known as Adios Nonino, that the composer wrote after the death of his father, and finally an excerpt from Richard Wagner's The Flying Dutchman. Dad was fond of symphonic music, and I remember a compilation record he liked called Songs of the Sea, with part of Wagner's opera on it. Once he took me to the Calgary Philharmonic with Bob Nelson along. We were listening to the opening program, and I pulled out some of those bent nail puzzles from my pockets. Soon, all 3 of us were hunched over in a row, working on those puzzles while the orchestra filled the Jubilee Auditorium. Music and a love of and a respect of the water were some things that my parents instilled in me. Without further ado, I should say, here is The Tempest, Tango Rhapsody, and The Flying Dutchman, dedicated to Dad's memory, accompanying Kathy's digital slide presentation as a meditation on the nautical aspects of Dad's life. Enjoy.
Thank you, Elaine, that was amazing. Everybody knows who I am. I'm Tracy, I'm the middle daughter. And no, Riley and I are not twins, although now I will take that as a total compliment. Dad would have been really touched to see everybody here today. He didn't want a service, he didn't want us to do anything. In fact, he asked that his obituary just say, Pat Brennan with his birth date, his death date, and the word, finally. He was never good with showing emotion, and I guess he felt that no one else should be obliged in that way, even for a good reason, like death. But all of you know, if you knew my father, that he had the best sense of humor. One morning at the farm, a couple of years after I'd moved in to help out, he had a rare day where he slept in quite late in the morning. When he finally came down, I told him I was just about to come up to see, to check if he was still breathing. He laughed his big, boisterous Brennan laugh and said, "The only way I'm going to be found dead in my bed is if I've been shot by a jealous husband." When I was growing up, my dad called all of my friends Veronica. I didn't actually know anyone named Veronica, but none of my friends were ever insulted by my dad not remembering their name. Tracy, Veronica's here. Tracy, Veronica's on the phone. It's actually pretty clever. I learned this lesson from my dad, that everything was funny if you came at it from the right direction. He used to say about himself amid some difficult, demanding farm job, "If only I'd been born rich instead of so damn good looking." I also learned that loving and being loved meant accepting your own shortcomings and of the people you love. Dad put up with a lot. He was the role model for not sweating the small stuff. When I went through hard times in my own marriage, I told Dad I was taking back my maiden name. He just smiled and said, "Welcome back." And that was about the extent of the emotional range he allowed us to see. At 87, Dad lost his barb. He also hurt his back quite badly and had to give up riding his motorbike. He sunk into a very deep and dark depression and refused to get out of bed for almost 10 months. His farming days were over, and he admitted the lodge had become necessary. What would a lodge do to a man who'd spent 40 years farming and way too much time alone? We figured he'd last about 3 months. And then he met Prim, his lovely, beloved Prim. Prim and Dad immediately found a connection. They shared a lot of similarities. They knew each other's childhood stomping grounds, and they had the same off-the-wall, sarcastic, goofy sense of humor. They found joy in each other's company, and they kept the boredom at bay. And Dad died in love. But this was not the shoot-'em-up, risk-your-life-for-one-last kiss kind of love that Marty Robbins would have been proud of. Dad was there for Prim when she needed a friend, and Prim was there for him when he needed her most. He was the luckiest of men. What more could a man ask for? Those of us blessed to be in love, and actually in love. There is no question this was the most glorious and peaceful of ways to live out your last days. This man, who carefully guarded his emotions his entire life, suddenly opened his heart and shared the love with all of us. We are so very grateful to our beloved Prim. What a gift. My father died in love. So here it is, Prim. I promised you a poem. Let the love in. On a park bench on a Friday with a cat, the man met a woman. They shared stories, admired flowers, made each other laugh. He asked her how she felt about romance. Her advice, as always, was go with the flow, and he fell in love. In their dreams, they go dancing and raise horses on a farm. They glide the slopes in Jasper, take a motorbike to Mexico, traveling together through the twisty paths of their youth, the long roads that brought them here, the short days that remain. And every journey begins with a single step, and sometimes it takes a lifetime to find the love we've lost. It's not about money, it's not about rank, it's not about pride or duty or what you think you deserve. It's not about whether you go to church on Sundays, what you do, or who you know. It's not about judgment or expectation, and most definitely not about what the damn neighbors think. On a park bench on a Friday with a cat, the man met a woman. They shared stories, admired flowers, made each other laugh. And sometimes a lifetime can be such a short time. None of us get out alive. It's never too soon. It's never too late. If you're lucky enough, go with the flow and let love in. Thank you.
Well, they say that hearing is the last thing to go when you're on your deathbed. The last song that Dad heard, according to his faithful and beloved companion, when he left this mortal coil, was the song Galway Bay. I'll follow this short instrumental rendition with a brief version by one of Dad's favorite singer-songwriters, the old Celtic bard Chris Christopherson. This song is in appreciation of Dad's last love of his life, Prim Spinell.
thank you all for coming today. I'm Kathy. I'm Pat's second child, eldest daughter. My nickname in the family is Pooh, because number 2. One of the great things about having a parent actually die of old age is that I have a literal lifetime of memories. And I'd like to share some of my favorites with you. When I was a kid growing up in Calgary, he was always busy with something, but he didn't mind if I sat quietly playing with nuts and bolts and washers while he puttered in the garage working on some woodworking project or another. CBC would be playing Saturday afternoon opera, and I'll never forget the smell of sawdust, which I still smell to this day when I hear opera. Weekends at the lake were special. He used to wake me up early in the morning, and I'd make a thermos of hot chocolate while the rest of the family slept. And we'd go out on the Tempest and look for a breeze on the glassy mirror of the water. There usually wasn't a great breeze at that time of day, but it didn't matter. We'd sit in comfortable silence. He'd usually fall asleep at the tiller. And one time I dribbled some cold lake water on his bare shoulders, and he woke up with a start and knocked me right off the boat. He continued sailing slowly away while I sputtered in the wake behind him. He did come about and pick me up eventually. We'd go back to the cabin and he'd cook up bacon and eggs for everyone. By then the wind was up and he would go out sailing again, either with Dawn or Mum or Bob or Louie or Arlene or whoever was interested. At the end of the day, he'd bring the sails into shore and we'd lay them out on the lawn to dry and fold them in a very specific way to be ready for hoisting the next day. I'd be a bit sunburnt, sand in my bathing suit, the smell of lighter fluid in the charcoal barbecue, hot dogs for the kids and steaks for the grown-ups. Those were the best days. Another of my favorite memories was spending 2 weeks hiking the West Coast Trail with him and Dawn when I was 15 years old. We trained for months carrying cans of beans in our backpacks around Edworthy Park in Calgary. And I had to carry the same load he and Dawn had, and they did not wait for me to catch up if I fell behind. I had never even seen the ocean before that, and here we were sleeping on the beach and scrambling through rainforests. It was a life-changing trip, and I knew then that I had to live on this island one day, although I wouldn't be able to move here for another 27 years. Dad called it God's country, and it truly is. After Ken and I finally moved here to the island, we saw a lot more of him. One day I convinced him to rent scooters with me and we tootled around Victoria while he tried not to be embarrassed every time he saw a real motorcycle. I loved hiking with him around Thetis Lake on Father's Day. I loved having he and Barb over for pot roast on Sunday evenings. He would always say, "Boy, oh boy, you can't get a meal like that in a restaurant." Although of course you could. You know, when my late husband Ken was diagnosed with lung cancer 17 years ago, Dad was the first person I told. It wasn't because we were so close emotionally. It was because the little girl inside me wanted her dad to make everything better. When Prim, his dear friend who was at his bedside, texted me to tell me Dad had died, that same little girl was devastated that her daddy had left. Gone with him is the magical thinking that he could fix anything in my life that was broken. When we lost our mom to cancer 46 years ago, I looked to him for strength. Oh, and he had it in spades. He was so strong, he was like a brick wall. You see, all of us are just products of our conditioning, and he was conditioned by his parents, who were conditioned by their parents, etc., etc. He was taught to keep calm and carry on, and that's what he did. He moved forward with his life and took us along for the ride. I know he must have been completely broken when he lost his wife and the mother of his 4 kids at such a young age. He never showed us how damaged he was. Maybe he was able to talk to someone about it, but it wasn't with any of us kids, and I guess that wouldn't have been appropriate given our tender ages. But he soldiered on, and in his true pragmatic fashion, became the lone captain of our battered ship, sometimes rather like Captain Bligh on the Bounty. There were things about his personality that drove me crazy until I learned to just accept him for who he was. We used to call him the Great Ostrich because he was very good at not facing difficult emotions. He used sarcasm in place of compliments. He refused to accept anger as a valid emotion. Conflict was to be avoided at all costs. Self-pity was non-existent in his world. Hubris had no place in our home, ever. We were always told not to get too big for our britches
or get too full of ourselves. Years later, my therapist asked me who I was supposed to be full of, if not myself. He wanted us to be successful, but he never gave us the traditional tools to do so. Once we were of age, we were expected to be completely independent, and he just let us figure life out on our own. And we were expected to put ourselves through higher education if that's what we wanted. One time, when I was desperately seeking recognition from him, I told him I had managed to attain 99% on my piloting and seamanship exam, and his response was, "I sure hope I'm not on board when you need the 1% you got wrong." But a week later, this is him, this is what he did. He said, a week later, he showed up with a brass bosun's whistle, compass, and a telescope in a beautiful wooden box. That's just how he was. He was a human being with human shortcomings. Like I said before, he was a product of his conditioning. We all are. The thing is that all four of us have grown into loving, kind, compassionate, and successful adults, in spite of and because of Dad's influence. So what did he do right? Well, he was a funny man, quick to laugh, and when he did, it was with his whole being. We inherited his sense of humor. He was a hard worker, the hardest working man I've ever known, and this taught us our work ethic. He was humble and straightforward, and this taught us to be kind and authentic. He was spiritual, not religious, but spiritual. His cathedral was looking for the wind on a still lake, or rubbing his dog's belly, or feeling the open road on his motorcycle. And this taught us to find the sacred in every day. He was strong, emotionally and physically. He never complained about aches and pains. The rare time he did get a cold or the flu, he'd go to ground, which meant holding up in bed for 3 days without asking for anything except to be left alone. This taught us to be self-sufficient and to rely on our own inner strength to get us through difficulties. He loved nature and the outdoors and taught us to have the same reverence for it. He was always learning and reading and not afraid to try something new, like when he took cooking classes at technical college when Mom became too ill to cook, or when he and Barb decided to become kiwi growers, walnut harvesters, beekeepers, or goat farmers, or when he decided to build a classic wooden sailboat with his nephew Grady. This instilled in us a lifelong passion for learning and growing as humans. He believed family to be the strongest bond there is, and the adoration he had for his own siblings, especially his big brother Bill, taught us to value and keep our own sibling bonds cherished and indestructible. As he neared the end of his life, he softened, as so often happens in our human experience. He became much more porous, easily moved to tears by the news of discovery of graves of Indigenous children in residential schools, or of atrocities in the Ukraine, or the plight of the unhoused. It became easier for him to tell us how much he loved us and how proud he was of us. I think the first time I heard him say, "I love you too," was just within the last 10 years. I am so grateful that we had him for 62 years of my life, and that I finally got to see the man behind the sarcasm and backhanded compliments. The man behind the brick wall he had to build to survive. I too have softened as I age, especially when it comes to accepting him for who he was. I loved to give him mushy cards in hopes I could generate an emotional response from him. One Christmas a couple years ago, I had dropped off a goodie bag with some homemade snacks and a mushy card. I can't remember exactly what I wrote in it. He didn't open the parcel until after I'd left him, and when I got home there was a message on my phone from him, which I saved because it moved me so much that he could finally express himself. I'd like to play it for you now. I'll have my phone over here.
Your dad. I just had to tell you, when you left that package for me, I just opened it up and got out the nuts and bolts and the popcorn and everything. And I was kind of cleaning up today, and I found a card in there. Cat, it's the nicest card I've ever seen. It's just, I have to call you. I just want you to know how much I appreciate this family that you all together. And every one of you is Thank you. Bye.
So typical of him in his later years, pours his heart out and then a curt bye. He never did like long goodbyes. And speaking of goodbyes, my speech is coming to an end. But I wanted to share what one of my Dharma teachers has to say about goodbyes. Sometimes it may feel that our life is full of goodbyes and separations, but in truth, there are no goodbyes, only endless moments of change. Once a being takes a place in your heart, they are with you forever. They cannot be erased or destroyed or even forgotten. They simply rest quietly until their moment comes to appear again in your memory. So take care of you and all others. Offer your most loving best and celebrate this love in all your relationships, for one day they and you will only be a memory. See you in the funny pages, Dad.
Dad's mother, Margaret Rennie, was a dear Scotswoman we called Nana. Her parents hailed from Aberdeen. When I first heard the name of the singer Nana Muscuri, I remember thinking how nice it was she adopted the name of our grandmother. I'll always remember Nana's fortitude and quiet strength. And Blind Fortune Turns the Wheel and the Skyboat Song are dedicated to her. Come fill the cup, let's drink to health, this night we'll merry be. For friendship and for harmony, likewise all friends will be. We'll meet again some other night, our secret joy revealed, and friends will stay whatever way blind fortune turns the wheel.
I'm Louis, son of Tracy and Frank. I have not a lot to say, but a little bit. My grandpa is a big part of the reason that I have such a joy of woodworking and such a joy of being on a motorcycle. Grew up watching him on that bike and fiddling around in the shop, usually causing a ruckus and hearing him say, "Oh, I wish you wouldn't do that." That never ended, by the way, up until the time that I met Molly and started being smart and bringing her to the shop and distracting him with her homemade cookies. I was then able to use the shop properly. But I really just wanted to tell one story that really stuck with me. For anyone that had the pleasure of being on the farm, there was in the corner by the little pond, there was a very large quartz rock. And I was helping him with the blackberries the one day, and we decided to take a break, and he made me his famous, just the water that sat on the stove with a fire pit, the whole day. He poured it out and made me some OXO, which still to this day I very much enjoy when I'm camping. But he sat me down and he had pricked himself with one of the blackberries on the top of his hand. And he grabbed my hand and he's like, let me see that for a second. And he pressed his hand on my hand and he called us blood brothers. And being the smart ass 12-year-old that I was, in my head I was thinking, we're already blood related. But I couldn't bring myself to say it. But that story has always stuck with me. That moment has never faded from my head. And I have him to thank for who I am today a little bit. Thank you.
So Patricia and Ed Brennan helped imbue us with a spirit and an appreciation of life. My mother had dreams of the two of them, Mom and Dad, of moving out to the coast eventually. While cancer curtailed that dream, her spirit, her equanimity, and her grace. Influenced us to aspire to love and to have compassion. Sincere, genuine love was her guiding principle. Her short life was cut in half, but she was full of personality and zest. This is to her and to her children. Oh, sorry, just a moment.
Pat's second love of his life. What a lucky man he was to have 3 amazing women in his life, and we're all grateful. Prim, this will be the first time that I meet you, even though we've talked on the phone. I look forward to giving you a hug. I would like to thank Dawn, Kathy, Tracy, and Riley for allowing me to be a part of this program. It's a real honor. My mom, Barb, moved to Canada after she raised 4 kids all on her own. She was seen as kind of a pushy woman to achieve what she did in the Bahamas. Then when she moved to Canada, she met and married Pat, and he was the opposite of everything she had known. He was calm, grace, and wisdom. Pat let my mom be the person that she was meant to be. He ensured she did not fall too far down the rabbit hole with her wild ideas. He put the structure and the depth into those projects and brought them to life. Instead of letting her jump over the edge with 2 feet, Pat guided her all the way. Instead of being told she was crazy, he treated her with respect and as an equal. When Pat came into my mom's life, I wasn't around much. I'd only seen him once or twice. I was in college when my mom called me and said she was getting married to this guy. I was really happy for her after all she'd been through. She said on the phone, "He is good, he is right, he is so worthwhile. He is everything to me. I'm going into a completely new life, and I feel very safe with him by my side." Pat treated me very well. I arrived at the farm at 19, and it was not where I wanted to be. They thought picking rocks in the field was a good thing to do, and I was not impressed. I avoided as much to do with all that dirt and rocks and outdoor chores as I could. Yet Pat treated me with the same amount of grace as he did my mother. He never once said, "Come out and help," although he should have. Instead, he was interested in what I was doing, amused by my comings and goings, and never had a negative thing to say about anything I did. Maybe that was the perks of being the stepdaughter. I was used to all of my mom's opinions, statements, and next big ideas, and I listened to maybe half of what she had to say. But when Pat spoke, I listened to all of it. Everything he said had meaning and purpose. I remember just a few years ago, I had some big idea about our business. I did the research, I made a plan, it all seemed great. I shared it with my mom, and as usual, she said, "Go for it." I shared it with Pat, and he made a few measured statements about his own business experience that showed me that maybe it was not such a great idea after all. And he was right, of course. Again, everything he said mattered. I particularly, Dawn actually kind of, even something he said reminded me, Pat also introduced me to the love of going to places like Capital Iron and digging around dusty and rusty things, looking for interesting things and wondering what they would do. I still love to do that kind of thing. Mom and Pat were definitely opposites, but they brought out the best in each other, and they had lots of good adventures on the farm and sailing, of course. In fact, it was a quick afternoon sailing trip that Pat gave me some of the best advice that I've ever received. I told him it was my first time sailing. He said, "If you don't know what to do, the best thing to do is to stay out of the way and duck." It's an excellent life lesson. Like my mom said on the phone that day over 40 years ago, he was good, he was right, he mattered, and he was so worthwhile. Thank you.
His talent for building things, fabricating out of wood and metal and plastic, wondrous devices and inventions, was always marked by a steady resolve to do it right. There was never anything jury-rigged or improvised in Dad's work. He spoiled me somewhat in that I would look at many of my friends and associates' attempts at repairs or construction, and I would see the jimmied, wired up red and green cartoonish workmanship, and I think it wasn't right. Other than the influence of meticulous artists and technicians around the family, such as Al Witherspoon, Bob Nielsen, and other friends, Dad's sense of craftsmanship was exemplary. From welding to making dovetailed joints, fiberglass molding to plumbing repair on the community water system at Windermere Lake, he was a hard act to follow. yet he was a lifelong inspiration in the details. He was peculiar in never being happier than when he was in his shop, his element of accomplishment and pleasure. Together, we had built a sailboat, a canoe, and rebuilt a Peterborough cedar strip skiff that someone had used as a flower planter in Calgary. We remade every last plank of that boat, save for about 4 we could salvage. His piece de resistance, of course, was Bailiwick Farm, that he and his second wife, Barbara Constance Brennan, created. Together, they made this little Shangri-La at the foot of Mount Newton. Not a few times he would visit, or I would visit after living and working there for a time, and I'd find a whole new building in place. There was always something being assembled or disassembled on his shop floor. The last big project he undertook, of course, was with Cousin Grady as a fellow enthusiast and boat building companion. And you will hear about the beautiful Haven 12.5 gaff rig sloop in due course. I mentioned that Dad had a wide-ranging musical taste that included a collection of symphonic works, the standards of Herb Alpert, Percy Faith, Xavier Cugat, and folk artists he and Mum liked. Dad was an early enthusiast of Gordon Lightfoot, and he bought Lightfoot's second album, Sit Down Young Stranger, in the early 70s. I still have it, along with Gord's Gold. It's largely the whole reason why I was drawn to guitar. As a nod to what he and Barb built together, and apropos of Gordon Lightfoot's passing on May 1st, here is an original, and then an excerpt from the song Lightfoot as another Celtic bard, released in 1980, the year that Dad bought the farm.
Ships of the line, ships of the morn, some who wish they'd never been born, they are the ghosts of Cape Horn. Fa-la-la-la-la-dum-dum, with a rum-dum-diddy and a rum-dum-dum, sailing away at the break of dawn, they are the ghosts of Cape Horn.
And that there would be Grady's cue.
what an amazing day for this to take place. And such an appropriate setting. Thank you, Kathy, for sharing your farm with us. I told you before, and I'll say it again, that Uncle Pat saw a kindred spirit in you, in that at about the same point in your life, you found yourself in the position that you could do what you wanted. And you chose to create and enjoy life on a beautiful farm. And that's something that I got to speak last. I'm not sure why, but I think that one of the nice things about funerals, if there's something nice, is that you do get to learn a little bit more about the person that you spent a lot of time with, but never really saw or appreciated that side of them. And so there's some things that have kind of come to my mind as I've heard you guys speaking that weren't as meaningful to me perhaps in the past, but are now. You know, when sometimes you'll hear somebody say a story sort of over and over again, to where you sort of think, you know, it has too much meaning to them. And one story that he told me quite a few times was the story of him leaving Calgary. So his wife had died, and he sold his business. And he showed up at his mother's house to tell her that he's leaving. And my grandfather was there. And my grandfather was a Supreme Court justice. He had the real sort of educated job. And in a lot of ways, Uncle Pat was more successful. He ran a successful business. He was financially independent at that point. And yet he walked in the door, and the first thing, she was talking to my grandfather about what he was going to do that summer, and he had 3 weeks off because he has this 3 weeks vacation. And the first thing she says to Uncle Pat as he walks in the door is, "You see, Patrick, if you'd have stayed in school, you'd have 3 weeks of paid vacation as well." So he moved out here and never worked another day in his life. So, you know, but you could tell he was receiving the same thing from his parents. I think that he sort of maybe passed along as well. So what you're saying about, you know, parents and passing things along to your kids really sort of spoke to me. So that was good. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Grady O'Neill, and my grandfather was Pat's brother. So he was my great uncle, and he was great in more ways than one. My earliest memories of Uncle Pat are when he would take our entire family of 5 on his 35-foot sailboat to Saturna Island to the lamb bake. And I don't know why, I think the reason it stands out in my mind so much is because he'd give me a knife that I could wear around my neck. And it was like, you know, my parents weren't giving me a knife or anything. Yeah, but he could, and I don't know, Mom just had to smile, I guess, because she's his uncle. So he definitely had a different tolerance for risk than my parents. Later, I can remember him driving me home from the farm on the back of his motorcycle. And Dad was an orthopedic surgeon, you know, taking care of crack-ups on the Malahat. I mean, there's just no motorcycles, just no. And so I think that, actually, my parents made sure that only happened once. And I'm pretty sure it's actually the one and only time I've ever been on a motorcycle. I also remember him taking the Kubota tractor and putting me in the bucket of the tractor, starting the chainsaw and putting it in my lap, and then raising the bucket as high as he could get it, and then he'd drive along, and I had to stand in the bucket and lop off the top of the cedar hedge with this chainsaw. And you think of it now, and it's just like, who would do that? But anyways, I thought it was pretty cool. He loved life on the farm, and so did I. He had a great sense of humor and great sayings, which still ring in my head. You know, at one point he told me it would be good kibitz. He'd say that a lot. Really, it's good kibitz to do this or do that. If you're going to restore something or build something, it's good kibitz. And I think it's got something to do with karma or whatever to build a boat. So in a moment of, quote, unbridled ecstasy, you know, whenever he'd start a project, it'd be like, yeah, in a moment of unbridled ecstasy, I bought this and that, and now we're sort of stuck finishing it, right? So in a moment of unbridled ecstasy, we ordered the wood. The deal was, Grady, you provide the brute force and ignorance, and I'll show you how to do it. So for 7 years, I took Tuesdays off and to build Tuesday's Child with him. I remember being stuck doing some miserable job like sanding, and he'd say, wow, can you imagine a man of your stature doing a job like that? Or he'd be sitting back and say, you know, I'd help you, but I've got all this paperwork. A lot of you probably wonder why I haven't finished the boat, and actually it's pretty simple. As time went by, we spent less and less time building the boat and more time solving life's problems over lunch and coffee breaks. I remember complaining that I didn't think I could take out another tooth. You know, I had it. Well, obviously I'm a dentist, and so I take out teeth. And him confessing that he felt the same way running his auto supply business and wondering if he could take another meeting to discuss the merits of the latest spark plug. He told me to remember that one of the great things about family is that you can get up and go to work. For your wife and kids. It's like the third funeral I've been on. I think I'd be getting better. But anyways, you can get up and go to work for your wife and kids when maybe you couldn't for yourself. He loved his family and was proud of all of you. I get the impression that maybe he said it more to me than some of you. So, Don, I know that he was proud of you. He was proud of your skill at the guitar, your writing, the cards you'd give him that had that were from covers of books from the library. You know, your ability to pick the cover of a book. It's Grady, can you believe they throw these out? And look at this. And then he'd tell me the story behind the cover of the book. And Tracy and the alpacas and that whole adventure, you know, how many times did I hear, Grady, if anybody can make a business out of a farm work, it'll be Tracy. And, you know, through no lack of effort on your part, I'm sure it's an impossibility now. You either have to retire from the auto supply business and do whatever the hell you want, or do something else, because the farm's not going to do it. Kathy and your weaving and, you know, the results, he knew exactly how well you did in everything that you put your hand to. So if he didn't tell you, he certainly took note of it himself. Riley and the glass art and the life that you built for yourself up north, he had great admiration for that, and just the way you did your own thing, right? And Louis, yeah, I mean, it was amazing to the both of us, actually. I can't tell you how many say he'd just shake his head, and how the hell did he do 1 year of a woodworking course, and he's better than either one of us. So he was aware of that. When he lost the shop, I moved the boat to my place. I lasted a couple of days doing it, and then I just realized that, well, I liked building the boat. I like spending time with him more. I didn't have time to do both. So I parked the boat and figured we only had a few months to a year. Then his friendship with Prim breathed a new life into him, and we got a few more years. He started out my great uncle and ended up greatest friend. Now we can rest in peace, and I will finish the boat. Thank you all for coming.
Into the music, I could go on. I want to hear everyone's stories. But a couple more sets here. I want to talk about Dad's father, Bampy, was a dyed-in-the-wool Irishman born in the Ottawa Valley who loved to sing Irish traditionals around the house. And in later years, his gusty vocalizing, especially when he couldn't remember the words, were relegated to scat singing, such as fiddly-dee and rum-a-dum-dum, along with a kind of hereditary toneless whistling. Once, Bampy held me on his knee and told me there was a song about the Brennans from the old country. What is it called, Bampy? I asked. He said proudly, Brennan on the Moor. Well, what is this Brennan on the Moor? I wondered, what is a moor? Yeah, I thought it sounded grand and heroic. The first time I heard it was Mum playing it instrumentally on the accordion from an old Burl Live songbook, learning it for some family function. Then I came across the Clancy brothers whooping it up. The song has long been associated, in my mind, with part and parcel of the green landscape in the Fair Isle my father's ancestors came from, and of Bampy's heritage. I also like to think there is a sideways reference to Uncle Bill and the main character of the outlaw, the Willie Brennan of the story. I always suspected Uncle Bill of having harbored a roguish sense of humor. Alas, my imagining the character in the song as a sort of Robin Hood ne'er-do-well do-gooder, robbing from the rich to give to the poor, was undermined by learning the historical figure was no more than a brigand, a thief, and a scallywag double-crossing men and cheating on women before getting hanged. But in the true Irish gift of the gab, the retelling of the incident gets a hearty reworking, full of bombastic fun, blarney, bluster, and ballyhoo. It has become the quintessential Irish pub drinking song. So it gives me great pleasure and privilege to be playing it on Mike O'Neill's guitar he gave me in 2021. I'll always treasure this instrument. Interesting to note that Mike passed away 18th of April, the same date as Nana did in 1995, age 99.
It's of a fierce highwayman, my story I will tell. His name was Willie Brennan, and in Ireland he did dwell. 'Twas on the King's Highway he commenced his wild career, and many a wealthy nobleman before him shook with fear. And it's Brennan on the moor, Brennan on the moor, oh brave Then with his loaded pistols, his story all unfold. He caused the bear to tremble and to deliver up his gold. 100 pounds was offered for his apprehension there, but Brennan and his lovely wife to the mountain did repair. And it's Brennan on board, Brennan on board, old brave and undaunted, stood young Brennan on board. And it's Brennan on board, Brennan on board, old brave and undaunted, stood young Brennan on board. And it's Brennan on board, Brennan on board, old brave and undaunted, stood young Brennan on board.
Putting on, and it's been fantastic from the Brennan side. I'm Kevin McHugh. I'm the youngest of Marion and Jerry's son. We lived out here for 4 years, and during those 4 years I really got to know Pat. I remember how I first got to know Pat is my aunt, who was in Calgary for less than a year, I think, at the time. Suddenly, she's found this guy in a boat and she's heading off to the coast. And then 3 years later or so, my mom and dad abandoned me and my younger sister, and basically we lived alone. And I thought at the time that was terrible, but actually it wasn't that. So I remember going to the farm, and I remember the Newfoundlanders, and there was all the dogs, and slobber to you, but fantastic dogs. And as I got to know Pat over the years, I was slowly, call it, welcome into the club. And he was always meticulous. I was impressed with everything he had in there, and he had everything to perfection. It was fine-tuned, and it was that. But, you know, initially it was, you could observe, and then going through that. Through my father, I'd done a number of lots of woodworking, and when we moved out here, I restored a condo and did their bath. So I built this truss, and I was allowed to touch the tools and get from there. And eventually he'd leave it unsupervised with, you know, initially looking over my shoulder. So I know what Louis went through and on there. And then I even got invited to his own private craft brewery upstairs. That was always a fantastic chats and going from that. But the last time, and I think it's Big Row, as we're talking with Tracy, and me and my daughter, my wife, had just got back from China, and we got one of those freak snowstorms. And there was probably about 2 or 3 feet in the driveway, and we'd parked our car at my parents', also on McTavish, by the way. And we got the neighbors, and we basically picked up the car and pushed it out of the driveway. And for some reason, that was that prairie stubbornness in both my dad and Pat. And it's like, nothing's gonna stop us. And I don't know, I kept saying, Dad, where do you wanna go? There's 3 feet of snow on the ground. It's not like you need to get out. You're well stocked, everything's great. And suddenly, the tractor, unbeknownst to there, Tracy phones me up and said, you know what they've done? So Pat had driven over, and I think it was probably one of the last times he'd driven the tractor, and Tracy goes, he never let me touch that tractor. He never let me touch there, and he'd come in and he'd ripped up half the lawn, and we had to go back and fix up his stuff in the spring. But that was their prairie determination of both my father and Pat, and I always laughed back at looking at all the snow and all the effort, but they were going to get it done regardless whether it was not. So, you know, thank you. And thank you, Tracy, for the time we spent and all the time we had there. And it was always nice to drive past Bailiwick and stop for a beer or stop for a chat. And or if I had to get some woodworking, he'd let me use his tools and everything else. So it was always great. Heard lots about the boat, by the way. Good and bad. But yeah, it was a long project. But yeah, it was great. And I miss him. And it's unfortunately with the pandemic, we never got to get out here and spend time with him after that. So thank you for Brennan for welcoming in the McHughes. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
I'm going to follow up on my brother, Kevin. I'm the youngest in the McHugh family. My name is Rose. Pat was one of the few people who I allowed to call me Rosie. And I think there's just something about the magic of his growly voice that made that okay. I'm going to keep this really short because Kevin's already mentioned it. But I think it would be doing a disservice to Pat if we didn't talk about the friend that he was. When he met my Aunt Barbara, some serendipity made it so that his farm was a mile down the road from where my parents moved to retire. So not only did Pat bring joy to Barbara's life, but he brought two sisters close together after decades of living across the world from each other. And somewhere in that mix, despite the fact that they had both lived in Calgary for many years, my dad and Pat became best of friends. They shared a lot in common, woodworking being the biggest one, but they also had a sense of humor that was very wry, and you could hear the laughter when the two of them would get together to talk. For whatever reason, I'm not sure, maybe because he came into our lives a little later, he wasn't Uncle Pat to us, he was Farmer Pat. And that's my memory of him. And he and Dad shared, I would say, the simple moments of life. So my memory of Pat is pulling up after being out running to get errands or groceries or something, and pulling up to Timor, and Pat's crotch rocket would be sitting in the driveway, steaming slightly, and he would have snuck around the house without telling anyone he was even there, and he would go for a swim out in Coles Bay. And then, if he felt like it, he would come back up the stairs, and my dad would often catch him at that moment and call him over, and they would have a beer and a gin and tonic on the deck at Timor. And I don't know what they would talk about. I suspect they would talk about the special women in their lives. I suspect that to some extent they would talk about the families that, even if they didn't say it, they loved dearly. And they would contemplate the ocean. And that was their friendship. And it went for 40 years. So I'd like to honor Farmer Pat and all that he meant to my dad, because he gave a lot in that friendship, and I think he got a lot back. So thanks to Farmer Pat.
I think I'm the shortest in the family, and always have been. So I think Uncle Pat always liked the fact that he was taller than me. So I'm Elizabeth Greer, and Uncle Pat was my uncle. And my mom was the youngest of that family, Rita. And I remember when your mom passed away, how devastated she was, because to her, he was her best friend. And then when Pat moved to BC, that was the second devastation. But she was so adamant that that relationship stay strong. And she loved Barb. And so she would come and visit and do those things. And then I was really lucky as I got older, I got to come out and visit. And I was an electrician, and I worked with tools. So Uncle Pat and I, imagine that, got along really well. I could operate any of the equipment that he had. We talked long term about things he was going to do with the farm, because Mom was a big gardener and planter. I knew how to deal with kiwi. He thought this was the best, and I loved coming to visit. Every long weekend I would come out, scuba dive for a part of the day, and then spend the rest of the day with him and Barb. And it was an amazing opportunity to be able to know him in a different way. And I think he was a little ticked at me one day when Barb desperately wanted to go visit Lee in the Bahamas, and he was very adamant about no one can take care of the farm. How can anyone take care of the farm? And I had come to visit, and Barb said, well, Elizabeth knows how to take care of the farm. And I didn't know that he wouldn't want this. So I said, sure, I'd take time off work and do this. This would be awesome. And I don't think he was overly impressed with me that day. I do know they had a wonderful trip. And just the opportunity to spend time using the chainsaw and cutting down trees for him and taking care of the farm and all of the plants was a great opportunity that I got. And then it just became us closer because I got to sort of live in his world, and I got to visit and spend more time with my cousins, which to me is the world to know. I do remember when he started building the boat with you, Grady, and the conversations we would have about how he would do that and what they were going to do. And he talked about the boat that he had built for my mom, the canoe. And I said, oh, well, I worked on that and I did some repairs on it. And he did a sailboat and stuff like this. And he said, well, if we ever need your help, you'll be getting a phone call. So Grady, if you ever do want to finish that boat, I have a few skills. And thanks for the opportunity.
Interesting character. He came from a family of interesting people, but my memories of Pat boiled down essentially to two areas. First, he was our Uncle Bob's best friend for many years. He introduced our uncle to sailing and to Lake Windermere. Bob eventually bought himself a sailboat and a property at Windermere, both due to Pat's influence. I will always cherish memories of Bob's enjoyment of life during that period. Pat and Patty certainly brought out the best in Bob and added enormously to his happiness. Secondly, Pat was a successful man of business, which speaks to his intelligence, ambition, and organizational skills. The element of his personality that was the most evident to me at the time, however, was his sense of humor. He could always see the lighter side of a situation and was not afraid to exploit it. One morning after almost 50 years ago now, we were sitting around the crowded Brennan breakfast table at Windermere Lake, and Pat said to me, "Derek, your father is an electrician, isn't he?" To which I responded proudly, "Why, yes he is." "Then would you mind plugging in the toaster?" Cheers, Pat. Thanks for the lovely memories and legacy. Derek.
Well, this is quite something to listen to all these wonderful memories and see those pictures. There's so many fond memories there. I'm Arlene Witherspoon. My first introduction to Pat and Patty was a trip in 1958 when my father passed away, and three friends suggested that I needed to break and I should go on a trip to the States with them. So we went for the weekend, a long weekend in May, to Kalispell. And prior to that, I had met someone who was in the Calgary Sports Car Club. And through them, when we were in this restaurant, the first night or second night, I met this fellow and went and spoke to him. And there were a number of fellows there, all from the Calgary Sports Car Club. And I thought, isn't that interesting? It kept talking about this couple who were this sort of there, but not there. And it turned out, I found out later, and it was Pat and Patty on their honeymoon. And they only turned up when they felt like it. So all I knew was there was this couple who kept turning up in the conversation, but nobody seemed to see them. And I met my husband at that time in Kalispell. And when we finally got together and married in '59, he introduced me to Pat and Patty, and we spent many wonderful evenings playing cards and just having, but every trip to the Brennans for cards meant time with my husband in the shop, looking at what Pat was working on at the time. My husband also loved to work on those kinds of things, and I think he built a firewall, a sailboat, which he did actually get into the water. Neither one of us knew very much about sailing. So we at this time had also been going to the lake continuously. And I can always remember Pat saying, as we took the first sail in this boat across the lake, that when we got back, his comment was, "I knew what was your problem," because we couldn't get the boat turned around very quickly. And Pat said, "They forgot to put down the centerboard." Sure enough, it took us quite a while. Over the years, we had so many wonderful memories at Windermere. Our children all grew up together. They have stories of their own that you would not believe. And only later in life did some of the parents find out. It has been a relationship that I have treasured all my life. And a word, I know when Patty passed away, we were living in England, and I had already left for England. My gift from Patty at that time was the first book of Best of Bridge. And I'm sure many of you know that book. And I had it on the plane with me because I just treasured it. We left a couple days later. And I was sitting there reading this, and you giggle away at the different things that were said in this. And somebody beside me said, "What is it you're reading? It's so funny, it's a cookbook." And I said, well, I showed them. I said, "It came from a very dear friend." I still use that cookbook. I'm not cooking much anymore, but I look at it with great pleasure and think of the wonderful times that we always had with the Brennans and their family. I thank you all for today. This is wonderful. And I really appreciate the time being with you too. So thank you very much.
I'll try to keep this short. So Uncle Pat, so I'm Patrick, and Uncle Pat was my Uncle Pat, clearly. I guess for some reason, as I was listening to all the different speeches, this quote came to mind, and it was, "All who wander are not lost." And I think that's the thank you I want to give my Uncle Pat, because growing up, I spent a lot of my life just feeling a little bit lost in the world. Like, is this all there is? Like, is it Victoria? Is it getting married, having kids? Is this the path? And I struggled with reading and math, and if you were to tell people that I teach at a university right now, they'd never believe you. But what I can say is that whenever I was with my Uncle Pat, I felt like I could be whoever I was. I didn't feel lost. I felt like a wanderer, and that was different. That felt fundamentally different. And so I guess I just really want to thank him for that. You know, I remember coming out to the farm and, you know, I could just sit beside him and I didn't have to fill the space with empty chatter. You know, he knew the economy of speech. And it was like, you could be with him and you would be thinking, what's more important than silence when you're in his presence? And I know he's one of few people who loved my brother more than me. And I'm okay with that. But I do remember there's one memory that stands out for me, and this is a short one, but he inspired me as well to get a motorcycle. 1975 BMW R66, an old one. And I don't know my head from my ass when it comes to motorcycles. I just thought it looked really cool. And I remember he saw it and he said, that's an old police cruiser. I said, no. He's like, yeah, that's where the officer used to put the tickets. And he showed, oh, really? And he said, he looked down at my boot and he saw this stain on it. And he said, looks like you got like oil and gas on your boot. And I said, yeah. I said, it's leaking gas for some reason. He said, it's leaking gas on your boot? And I said, yeah, I don't know what the deal is. And anyway, he opened the tank and he saw that it was a rusty tank I got sold. So clearly the guy knew who he was selling the bike to. And Uncle Pat, started up the bike. And then he started laughing and he said, come here. And he leaned down. He said, do you hear that? I said, what? He said, your bike's yelling. he said, your bike isn't meant to yell. And he looked at me, he's like, and we aren't either. And he said, your bike is meant to sing. And he told me how many RPMs it's meant to sing at. And then he leaned down, and I had taken that bike to 2 other mechanics to try to fix this problem. And he looked down, and immediately he could see the gas dripping from the float bowl. And he leaned down, and these other mechanics, for some reason, had such a hard time getting this little latch off the float bowl. It was just so secure, so they'd get a wrench, and they'd just like kick it, and it was just rough, and they couldn't do it. Uncle Pat, he made them look like pubescent adolescents who'd never untied a bra. Like he just went down and he just kind of finagled it and flicked it up effortlessly. And then the float bowl dropped and the gas poured out. He said, you got rust in your fuel line. And I said, oh, okay. But what I remember about that is, I never felt, like the ignoramus that I was at the time when it came to motorcycles. And he was very patient with me. And and I think he's the reason why, I've traveled so much and I've wandered and not felt bad about it, So if he was here, I would just thank him for that.
The Victorian with Pat was quite something. And I can encapsulate my relationship with Pat in 2 or 3 sentences. When I parked my car on the afternoons in August and September of 2021, Pat would motion me over to his patio table where he was sipping his Caesars. And I thought he looked harmless enough. But boy, did I get that
wrong. Take this moment, maybe for a, if everyone has a libation, I'd say water or something, and I'd like to propose a toast. And partially, of course, for everyone coming from near and far to do this. And we're going to send you off with our last finale, but I think beforehand we'll raise a glass. Patrick Francis Brennan. I want to say thank you, everyone, for coming out and taking this time and out of your day. Although I don't feel too sad for you to come out to the island in this weather. I hope it's worthwhile. But a big heartfelt thank you to dear friend Kathy Christopher for generosity and letting us use this highly appropriate farm for Dad's send-off. Please feel free to mingle, enjoy some food and drink, tour the beautiful grounds of Kathy's spread here. If you go through a gate, make sure you just close the gate. It's a working farm. Peace and comfort to all of you. Thank you again.